Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from where you're tuning in from for TMF Week Day 2. I'm your host, Danny Gold. Like I said, I'd be here hosting the morning sessions, getting you guys bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and really excited here for TMF Week. I got Karla with me, who I'm going to introduce and give a formal introduction in a little bit. But what do we always like to do? You guys, can you hear me? Am I loud enough? Tell me where you're tuning in from. Tell me what you're drinking this morning. And and then we'll get started. I'll give people a little time to get filed in. Oh my God, I see Indiana, Philly, India, Denmark. Oh, see, you got Karla's in Copenhagen, whoever said they're from Denmark. So there you go, you're representing. Raleigh, New Jersey. Oh my God, amazing. I love this. This is such a spread. Alrighty, guys. So I'll just get into the housekeeping real quick. So we know the same old questions that we hear all the time. All the sessions are going to be recorded. I know that yesterday we were having a little bit of issues, so they might be available at the end of the event. We're hoping they're available at the end of the day. We are going to let you know once that's all sorted. All the attendees, you're going to receive a certificate of attendance for the entire TMF week. All the questions are going to be answered at the end of the presentation. I'm going to say we got 15 minutes for QA, so don't ask your questions in the chat and we will make sure that we get to them. And then we're going to have our networking breaks after the session. So we'll see you all in the lounge. Karla's going to be hanging out. I'm going to be hanging out. You can ask some more personal questions and some questions like more intimately there. And so for the session timeline, Karla's going to present for 30 minutes. Then we have 15 minutes of the Q&A. We're going to do our next session we're going to do the introduction of the next session, and then we'll have our break in the lounge. And so, Karla, you're going to be presenting the EU CTR and its impact on the TMF. And so I'll let you introduce yourself and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much, Danny. Can you guys hear me?
I can, loud and clear.
Perfect. Okay. So it's just first slide, the mandatory meet the speaker slide. So my name is Karla Navera-Andersen, and I work at Ascendis Pharma based in Copenhagen. I recently went over to the dark side to work as a clinical trial manager after working mainly with the TMF for over 14 years. So I started working as a student helper, getting many paper cuts in the TMF paper archive in a large Danish pharmaceutical company. And now many years later, I'm working with TMF processes and oversights, which I guess gives mainly cuts to the soul. So anyways, as mentioned, I recently became a trial manager. And one of my main tasks here is working with clinical trial submissions under the EU CTR. And that will be my topic for today. So this date is absolutely monumental, but it means nothing to you at all. It only means something to me. And this is the date where I had my very first meeting regarding the EU CTR. See, I was tasked to oversee Ascendis Pharma's very first clinical trials application under the new CTR. And I know what you're thinking. Karla, you work with the TMF. Why are you involved with submitting a clinical trials application? Well, I was wondering that myself. But as many of you know, when you work for a smaller company, you get to wear many hats. So anyways, there I was wearing my EU CTR hat. I had the meeting with our study team and our CRO, arguing on how to divide the task between us. And at that point, I naively had no idea how much the EU CTR would affect the TMF processes in our company and how that single meeting would lead me here in front of you today. Okay, the EU CTR. So as mentioned in the beginning, I had no idea how much the EU CTR would actually affect the TMF processes at Ascendis. After all, the TMF is only mentioned briefly in 2 articles of the regulation, in Articles 57 and 58, which is not a lot if you consider that the regulation is 99 articles long. So what is mentioned here is nothing really all that groundbreaking. It's the good old sponsor shall keep a clinical trial master file that contains essential documents. There's a little about the quality of the data and the classic readily available and directly accessible. So there's nothing really new here for anyone who's ever worked with the TMF. Then there's the requirement about archiving the trial master file. Now we have to store the TMF for at least 25 years. And during this time, it has to be readily available, accessible, and of course, legible, and some other requirements for the archived TMF. So all in all, looking at the EU CTR and what it says about the TMF, it looks pretty harmless. But in reality, the regulation doesn't give any details on how to do any of these things practically. And this is where many of us, I think, run into challenges, because what does the change under the EU CTR really mean on a practical, tangible level? So that's what I will be talking about today. I'll be speaking about the TMF processes in Ascendis Pharma and how the EU CTR, or more precisely, the introduction of the Clinical Trials Information System, the CTIS, affected our TMF processes. And just a quick disclaimer before I really begin, this presentation will mainly look at the documents related to submitting a clinical trials application in the system. So setting the scene. So I got to admit, rocking the eTMF process board in Ascendis wasn't all that difficult to begin with. Relatively to other Danish pharmaceutical companies, Ascendis Pharma is a smallish young company being founded in 2006. So some of our processes are quite robust, but others are also impaired by the fact that we are just 17 years old. It's not a secret that our TMF processes are still a work in progress, still today. And the change management has been interesting. Our TMF system went live in 2020, and the first eTMF managers were hired only a year after. Before our eTMF system was implemented, people would file in one of these many places. Just to name a few, the Rimvault, SharePoint sites, and Box. And we do know that this was not at all sustainable. And also we knew that it wasn't really all that compliant. Even so, when the Viva eTMF system, Clinical Vault, was finally implemented, we still had challenges in getting people to actually use the system and getting them to adhere to the new eTMF processes. So, and you're thinking, what has this got to do with the EU CTR? Well, the EU CTR processes and the requirements of the new system, the CTIS, made it both better and also maybe somewhat worse. These are the processes or aspects of our TMF that was mostly affected by the introduction of the EU CTR. So where and how our documents are stored were affected. This is where I personally think that the introduction of the EU CTR was a blessing in disguise. New documents were introduced, and this meant for us figuring out new locations in our TMF. And then the introduction of redactions made us question, are you a document all on your own or just a duplicate? And then there's the data fields, modifications, and other notifications in the system. They're now being done directly in the CTIS. And this poses some documentation issues for us. And then finally, there are the approvals and listings of the approved documents. We're still pretty challenged regarding the format of the approvals that are now assessment reports and not actual approval letters like we're used to. So on top of our TMF startup challenges in the company, we also had to consider these all of a sudden. So let's talk about how we handled each one. So I hope this is a safe space because I'm about to air a bit of some dirty laundry. And so any regulators on the call, please close your ears because as mentioned earlier, the eTMF documents in Ascendis used to be a little scattered. Working with several CROs and having no clear processes or an official eTMF repository before 2020 made for the perfect storm. And now, even almost 4 years after the official launch of our eTMF, we're still having issues. Aside from the obvious issues of documentation stashed all over the place, our biggest issues was, as mentioned, change management. It was difficult for us to get people on board with only having one eTMF repository. In the case of our CROs, I think they like working under their own SOPs and their own systems and not having to be trained in one more system. And also internally, I think it was really difficult, but people got used to not having any rules to live up to. And they had also just gotten used to the fact that they didn't have to be trained in order to access a repository. So even though the eTMF management team thought it was a good idea to just use one repository, it was really hard for us to get people to agree. However, with time and a lot of work in creating awareness, we went from the mess there to the left, to the one on the right. And for a while, it worked really good, actually. I mean, yeah, we still had internal staff accidentally filing their eTMF documents in VaultRIM, and because they were just used to doing that. And also we had to remind people to cross-link their documents into the eTMF, but that was the least of it. It was no biggie. The game changer, however, was the CTIS. And the implementation of this really made a difference, because you see, the number one excuse our internal users had for not wanting to use the eTMF, especially for the submissions document, was that these documents are used for a regulatory submission, and therefore they belong into the VaultRIM. So it was difficult for us to get the submission documents that were also eTMF documents into the eTMF. The thing with the CTIS submissions, however, is it is now one combined submission. So in the olden EU clinical trials directive days, you had to do a regulatory submission and an ethics submission. So some documents might overlap, but in reality, they were two separate entities, but not anymore. Now it's just one submission with one outcome. So we want to store these documents in one place. So no more just storing submission documents in RIM and then ethics submissions in eTMF. Now they have to be stored in one place. So this is where we got really sneaky, because one of the tasks I had while wearing my EU CTR hat was to write the work instructions for the EU CTR submissions. And as an eTMF manager at that time, I made sure to write in that no documents could go into the CTIS unless it was filed in eTMF. So if a document was to be part of the submission, the document owner or the one responsible for filing was to provide the eTMF Viva ID to the person responsible for uploading them to the CTIS, which was incidentally also me. So that was great. So this made sure that the internal stakeholders would get their documents into the system. It also made sure that the documents considered only to be relevant for the regulatory submission was also cross-linked into the eTMF. So this made a huge difference for the filing of our country and local submissions document, as we delegated this task of filing the local documents to our CROs. So these documents quickly made its way to our eTMF, because the big change we also did was to give our CROs direct access to the eTMF. And we would only share our master documents through the eTMF. So if they needed a master document to create a local adaptation of an ICF, for example, they could only retrieve it directly for the eTMF. So, we were not allowed to share anything through emails, Box, or SharePoints. So we got rid of that. So this solution not only served me as the eTMF manager at the time with getting all the submission documents into the system in a timely manner, but it also turned out to be much more time efficient, which is important when you have tight submission deadlines, and especially for the requests for information for the submissions. Because CTIS also has a requirement for this request for informations, the RFIs. They are sent into the system, and the maximum days that you can have to answer an RFI is 12 days, which I think isn't really much if you have to update a protocol, for example, get those changes approved, send the protocol to translation, and also redact the protocol. So the timelines for responding to these RFIs force us to actually work inside of the eTMF. So having the submission documents live in the eTMF made it much easier and quicker for everyone involved. And the result of this is it's just that we got quicker at answering RFIs, we got quicker in our way of collaborating. So people really got, they just were happier that we now have all the submissions document in one place. So that was, a nice motivator for people to get the documents in. But this now means, though, that we have documents that used to live elsewhere in our eTMF. So instead of referring to those documents, elsewhere in our TMF index, they have become actual residents in the eTMF. So we had to update our TMF indexes and our TMF structures, which is, anyways, which was fine because we had to update them because of the new documents that were also a requirement of the EU submission. So with the new EU CTR, new documents became a requirement. There are, of course, few more than what I have listed here, but these are the documents that we have encountered so far. And I also had to find a home for in our eTMF. So, of course, when we started talking about where to file these documents, no one bothered to check if anyone else has solved the problem before us. So there we were, reinventing the wheel and doing it all wrong, because what we did is we filed all these documents under SOM 411. And as you can see, indicated by the big red letters, that this was a big no-no. So we pretty much stuck them all under the IRB IEC submission, because these were created for the Part 2 part of the EU submission, which is reviewed by the ethics committees. So we thought, yeah, easy, just put them under the ethics committee artifact. And we thought we were really smart until we attended a meeting with the Danish eTMF network. So yeah, just a side note, Denmark has a very large eTMF network composed by eTMF persons from different pharmaceutical and biotech companies and also CROs. And we meet regularly to discuss common eTMF issues. So anyways, during one of these meetings, someone presented us the TMF reference model suggestion for where to actually file these documents. The suggestions that the TMF reference model came up with, of course, made much more sense, because there were actually already sections in the reference model that we could use for these documents, and also because these documents are related to other things than just the IRB submissions. So while you can argue that the reference model is just merely a suggestion, I think we could really have benefited from doing our research before blindly just adding them where we think it would be easier to fit in. Because what happens now is that we have to move these documents to the correct locations. We also have to change the trial-specific TMF structures or indexes, as some of you would call it, for the trials involved, and the TMF structure template, which all our TMF structures are based on. Because yes, we did update our TMF structure template to include these documents and their faulty locations, and that's another big mistake. Because now we have to, create a new template. But also, we also have to retrain our document owners and the CROs on filing, which I think is fine. It's not a big deal, but I think we could really have saved ourselves some time and pain if we had just thought, I bet someone has thought of this before us. So just let's look it up. So what we learned, apart from where the documents are actually filed, is that we really need to use the resources we have, because new to us doesn't mean new to all. And that brings me to the next document requirement, which is the redacted documents. So since the whole point of the EU CTR and the CTIS is transparency, some of the documents submitted in the CTIS will at some point become publicly available. This means that we need to protect our company confidential information and abide to the GDPR. So we do this by redacting the confidential information on the documents that will be public, and we enter them in the CTIS in the for publication part, and the document with the sensitive information will go into the not for publication part, so it doesn't become public. So that's just the basic gist of it. So for those who haven't seen a redacted document before, there's one there on the right. Basically, it's just a document with black boxes on top of the secret information. So this is, in fact, a new type of submissions document for the eTMF, but it's sort of a different kind of animal, and we had to discuss a lot of things in regards to the redacted documents in our company. And also during one of the sessions yesterday, this also sparked a bit of a debate, and we discussed the exact same things as the people in the chat discussed, because we considered if these will crowd our eTMF, because now basically you have a document and then the redacted part, and then you have twice the amount of the same document. So will these crowd our eTMFs? And then we also discussed, are these documents even a part of the eTMF at all? because I know that they are part of the submission, but technically they're just covered up copies of a document that already live in the eTMF. So are they the duplicates? But then again, it's still a document that was a valid and required part of the submission. So it is a document in its own right. So for this, we had a discussion in a different Danish network, this time with the EU CTR network. And I also did, in fact, consult the internet this time. And while I couldn't find something conclusive, I did find a quote, which I think is sort of interesting. Someone wrote that nothing in the regulation states that the redacted versions need to be stored in the eTMF. I think this is really interesting. However, I live by the rule that just because we don't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Just because the regulation doesn't mention it directly, it doesn't mean that the regulators don't expect something to be there. So I think it's very tricky. People also mentioned, I think yesterday, that there's an option to refer to the CTIS for the redacted versions of the documents, but we actually don't know how long the CTIS will retain the submission documents. So if the documents are removed from the CTIS before the 25-year retention requirement, then that's going to be an issue as well. So the current solution in Ascendis Pharma is the redacted versions are a part of the eTMF. And also they are filed under the same section as their non-redacted counterparts. And, anyways, they were there to begin with because, again, it was a requirement from the work instruction that everything that goes into the CTS must be filed in eTMF. So it was fine. They were already there. But we still have doubts in which sections of the eTMF to actually file these because, behind the black boxes, they're just basically, the protocol or a CV, but they're not actually used for anything other than submission. So in that case, we're discussing to actually move them to the submission section instead. And I think also that was something we discussed in the chat yesterday as well. So, but in terms of our own processes, we're a bit unresolved about this, unlike the next one, which is about the data fields and modifications. And I know, rambling like I do right now, it sounds like I don't like the CTIS or the EU CTR very much, but I actually quite do. When wearing a submissions manager hat, I think the system is really awesome because it is one place for all the submissions made in the EU for my specific trial. So I have a complete timeline of what has happened. All the country submission documents are in one place. The versioning of the documents are clear and systematic. Also the naming of them because they have a naming standard. I could go on. It's actually a very, very nice system. But as an eTMF manager, I think the CTIS can seem to be a bit of a GCP nightmare. That's what I thought so in the beginning. And I mostly thought of this because of all the data fields in the system. So when you do any kind of submission in the system, you have to fill in a lot of data fields. So these could be, I think I have an example in the next slide. So this could be, information about the trial population, the IMP, even the third parties go into data fields. So you enter these into the system and it becomes a part of your submission. So in reality, much of this information is actually contained elsewhere within the submission documents. So is there really any issue in documenting and filing these in the eTMF? You could argue no. However, all this data is still a part of the submission. And somehow I personally want to have proof in my eTMF that this is the information that we entered into the system at that certain time, because once again, we don't know how long the CTIS will retain our information. So for the longest time, I was thinking, how do I document all this data that we entered into the system? So do I make a spreadsheet of all this information and then, save it to the eTMF? I was too lazy to do that, so I scrapped that idea. Then do I take a screenshot of the system and add all the images into one long document? Again, that didn't seem like a great idea either. So again, instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, I used the internet. And here I found something really useful. I found a recording of a workshop, suspiciously named the same as this presentation, hosted by the TMF reference model. And during that workshop, someone brought up this exact issue, which isn't an issue at all because another really smart person said, you do know you can just download that from the system, right? And I was shocked. Was it really that easy? And it was. So in the system, everyone did not see that there's a little download button up on the left, on the right side of the screen, and voila, you can download pretty much anything and everything that has been submitted in the system, be it documents, data in the fields, anything. So with the touch of a button, you can actually have whatever you need for your eTMF filing needs. So for me as an old submissions manager, it's sort of turned upside down, because usually you would create a cover letter listing all the documents that you wish to submit, and then create your submission package. And then maybe you would file these together depending on what your process is at the time. But now you have the option of actually pulling the submission package out of the system after you have submitted the package, which actually makes it a bit more factual, because this is an accurate picture of what the submission package was at the time that you submitted it. So I think this is a huge improvement, both in accuracy and also ease, especially if you have trouble collecting all your submission documents for the TMF, like we did at one point. So this could be a new step in our submission process and maybe others, and ultimately would also affect our eTMF processes, because pulling the submission package out of the system and having a submission package after the submission is sort of a new step. And we haven't yet decided if it's something we want to implement, actually. And when we do, you also need to figure out where it goes in the TMF, because again, the submission is no longer split up into the regulatory submission and the ethics submission. But this function is definitely a source of potential improvement to our processes, which actually leads me already to my last topic, which is approvals and list of approved documents. I know I just said that you could download everything from the system, and it's really great, but there's still one thing that doesn't work well for me, and that is not getting a proper approval letter. So when your submission has been approved, you'll get this very nice thing in the system called an assessment report, where they confirm you've been a very good submissions manager, you did everything right in the system, and they approve your submission. And that's all really good. But for the Part 2 submission assessment report, the one that the ethics committee assesses, there's not a list of documents that have been approved. And this is a bit tricky, because, this wouldn't be a huge issue if you actually list all the documents in the submission letter. But with the CTIS submissions, you don't do that. We certainly didn't, because it was not a requirement. And also, you could argue that it isn't really an issue at all, because the list of submitted documents can be accessed in the CTIS. It says so right there in the red box. But it says submitted. It doesn't say approved. So maybe it's a given, but I think for me, it's kind of a gray area. Because you could say, it's not an issue at all, but I think it's really, it's really difficult for an eTMF manager to do a completeness review, say approved documents within a country, because they won't have a list of documents in either a cover letter or an approval letter to check it up against. So, so if I was an eTMF manager, I wouldn't know if I have all the submitted documents, because I can't I don't have anything to compare it against, and we don't actually give people access to the CTIS. Not everyone, so it's a bit of a tricky situation. And also to also say it's an issue to our monitors as well, because when they go into our eTMF, they won't know which of the documents are the approved documents, approved versions. They will go in and they see 5 to 6 versions of a country-specific ICF, and they won't know which is the currently available one, because they don't have the latest approval letter to check it up against. And this was actually something that got us into a bit of trouble with a site in Ireland, because they flat out refused to use an ICF, because they didn't have a letter from the Irish Ethics Committee stating that this exact version was reviewed and approved by the Ethics Committee. And we totally get it. They're just adhering to the ICH GCP rule that you have to be able to document that this document and this exact version has been approved by the EC. So it was actually a real challenge for us. So what we did in this situation was we took screenshots of the system and we sent it to them, basically asking them to trust us. But I don't see this as sustainable at all. I mean, we do have a tracker of which document versions have been submitted in the system, but still this doesn't replace a proper approval letter. And also another sponsor in our eTMF network has solved this issue by telling us that they make a list of all the documents in the submission letter, which is fine. And then they take screenshots of the system, and then they combine these documents with the assessment report. But my personal opinion is that we shouldn't be making patchwork documents to prove that a document has been approved by the EC. So I don't think it's right. So in the early days of the EU CTR, I did hear rumors on the street that there were assessment reports containing list of documents and which versions were approved. But I actually only seen one with my own eyes, and that's from the Ethics Committee in Ireland, funnily enough. And that was after we gave them the feedback that it wasn't sustainable. So I think this is something that we want to urge everyone to do. It's actually give feedback to the authorities, as some of these things pose real issues on a practical and documentation level. And I just know that this is something that will be an issue when we get inspected at some point. So that was quick. Conclusion. Of course, the topics I went through today were not the only things about the EU CTR that affected our processes. I mean, they affected all the processes in Ascendis Pharma. But our TMF was heavily influenced by the EU CTR. And many of the things that I mentioned here are still causing us a lot of trouble. Excuse me. But I do hope, as I conveyed, the EU CTR is not just causing us trouble. It has, in fact, made us, reevaluate some of our existing processes and forced us to create some new ones that was actually very much needed. So what I think is really interesting, though, with a change like the EU CTR, is that when something like this is implemented from above, we should all sort of go through it together. And then we can immediately find information about how people are solving these issues, and we can get help from each other along the way. So, and also because of this, because we are talking together this much, we can provide input back to the authorities and ask them to consider some things that are especially time-consuming and counterproductive for us all. And not because it has brought upon the biggest of changes, but I still like to think that it does make a difference and will make a difference one day if you constantly provide feedback and share learnings like we're doing today. Thank you. Any questions?
Stage, I don't know. Oh, here we go. Sorry, it's a bit of a delay for me to get on stage. Karla, that was amazing. I have a bunch of questions for you that I'm going to pull up on screen. And drink your water. Take your time. Don't worry, you're right at the end there, and, and we want to make sure.
Suddenly, my allergy flared up. I have hay fever, so yeah.
So we'll start with this question from Brandon. He says, "Are the submissions or the approved files zipped when you download them from the CTIS? Do you allow the filing of zip files in your TMF?"
Yes, the files are, when we download from CTIS, they are zipped very nicely, actually. And also, they are also divided into nice folders. We do allow zip files in our eTMF, but then we have to actually download them to be able to view them. So we don't have the viewable rendition in the eTMF. We're not sure yet if that's okay. But we haven't, we haven't gotten any comments from audits or, mock inspections in that sense. But yeah, we do allow zip files in our eTMF.
Perfect. Amazing. And then we have this one from Helene. Said, "How do you file documents applicable to several countries?"
We use Viva eTMF, so we can add them in the metadata. So in the metadata, we'll just add as many countries as the document is applicable for. So they will show up in the country folders if you add the country in the metadata for the different documents.
Perfect. And then we got this one from Juanita. Isn't it double the amount of work to file documents in the CTIS and in the eTMF, or is it just for certain documents that they use both systems?
Well, we have to file in the CTIS when we do the submission. When we don't file in the CTIS, we submit the documents in CTIS. So that's outside of our eTMF, because that is the system where we do our submissions. So I mean, yeah, it does seem like double amount because you're actually. I didn't say anything about this, but it's actually a very manual process to upload documents into CTIS, something that also poses a lot of issues for us, actually, because you would pull the document out of the eTMF one by one, and then you add them to the CTIS one by one. So yeah, it is double the amount to work with documents in the CTIS and the eTMF. It doesn't have that, we don't currently have smart ways to, pull out the documents and upload them to the CTIS, and the CTIS doesn't accept, I think, bulk uploads in that way just yet. Yeah, it does. Someone says it does duplicate the activities. It does, yeah. You're welcome.
Sorry, I was kicked off stage for some reason to the Goldcast. I'm back. What about master ICFs? They need a Word format to adapt it to local templates, but by cross-linking it, you get a snapshot of the PDF cross-link from RIM to eTMF.
Yes, our master ICFs are born in eTMF. So they're born in eTMF, they're not cross-linked to the eTMF. So they're born in there, and then, yeah, the CROs or whoever adapts them can get them directly from the ICFs. And another fun thing is that documents in the CTIS need to be reformatted to PDFA. So you can't just pull your documents out of the system and then upload them as they are. They also need to go through a manual process. Well, not manual. You can do it in bulk, but yeah, you can't just drag and drop them.
Amazing. I have a personal question that came up. I know Oliver asked it too, but are there any other groups like that one in Denmark, the TMF group that you were talking about? Because that sounds really, really cool. And I was wondering.
I think it's I think it's quite special because I'm a part of. First, I was a part of the EU CTR group, and then they meet, I think, every other month. In the beginning, they met more frequently because there were so many questions about the EU CTR. But it's actually a lot of people from different pharmaceutical companies. We meet, and there's no competition. There's a lot of sharing because, I mean, as I said, we go through this together. I mean, no one wants to keep the secrets to themselves. They do want to share with each other because, I mean, it's difficult for all of us. So if someone has figured something out, then they are gladly sharing it. So we have the EU CTR network. Those are mostly people who are submissions managers and work with the regulatory submissions. And then we have the eTMF network, which also, again, I think maybe we're like 50 or 60 members who meet twice a year. And then we discuss issues. And then we also share, inspection findings on eTMF. And we also sometimes, share, any recent process updates to our eTMF systems and smart ways of doing things.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody. Karla, thank you so much again.
Oh, thank you.
You're wonderful.